The morning started like any other Tuesday at Lincoln Elementary School. Principal Robert Henderson sat behind his large wooden desk, sipping his third cup of coffee while reviewing the day's schedule. 25 years in education had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to walk through his office door. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Margaret, the school secretary, her voice carrying that familiar tone she used when a student was in trouble. "Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Patricia is bringing a student to see you. Says it's urgent." Robert sighed and set down his coffee mug. Another discipline issue, he thought. Maybe a playground fight or someone caught cheating on a test. He'd seen it all over the years, and honestly, very little surprised him anymore. He straightened his tie and prepared to put on his stern principal face, the one that made even the toughest fifth graders think twice about their actions. The door opened, and Mrs. Patricia walked in with a small boy trailing behind her. The kid couldn't have been more than 10 years old, thin as a rail, wearing jeans that had seen better days and a faded blue t-shirt that was probably a hand-me-down. His sneakers were worn at the edges, held together more by hope than by actual stitching. But what caught Robert's attention most were the boy's eyes. They were cast downward, staring at the carpet like it held the secrets of the universe. "Thank you for seeing us, Mr. Henderson," Mrs. Patricia began, her voice tight with frustration. "We had a situation in math class this morning that I think you need to address." Robert gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please sit down." "What happened?" The boy shuffled to the chair and sat down slowly, his feet barely touching the floor. He clutched his hands together in his lap, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. Mrs. Patricia remained standing, clearly too worked up to sit. "We were discussing pi in class today," she explained, pacing slightly. "You know, the mathematical constant. I was explaining how it's an infinite number, goes on forever, and that mathematicians have calculated it to millions of digits. Then this young man here," she gestured toward the boy, "interrupted the entire lesson." Robert raised an eyebrow and looked at the child, who seemed to be trying to make himself invisible. "Is that so? What did you say?" The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard and tried again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just said I could recite it." "Speak up," Robert said, not unkindly but firmly. "I can't hear you." "I said I could recite pi," the boy repeated, slightly louder this time. "To 500 places," Robert blinked. He looked at Mrs. Patricia, then back at the boy. 500 decimal places? The kid nodded, still not making eye contact. Mrs. Patricia jumped in, her voice rising. "That's exactly what he said, right in the middle of my lesson." The entire class erupted in laughter. Kids were calling him a liar, a show-off. It completely derailed everything I had planned. Then he insisted he was telling the truth, which just made things worse. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying the boy carefully. In all his years as an educator, he'd dealt with his fair share of attention seekers. Kids who made up wild stories to impress their classmates. Students who exaggerated their abilities to seem cool or different. This had all the hallmarks of one of those situations. "What's your name, son?" Robert asked. "Tommy," the boy mumbled. "Tommy Chen. Well, Tommy, that's quite a claim you made in class. Do you understand why your teacher is upset?" Tommy's shoulders hunched even more. "Yes, sir. When we say things that aren't true, especially things that disrupt class and waste everyone's time, that's a serious problem. It's called lying, and it's not something we tolerate at this school." "But I'm not lying," Tommy said, finally looking up. His eyes met Robert's for just a moment before darting away again. "I really can do it." Mrs. Patricia let out an exasperated sigh. "Mr. Henderson, I've been teaching for 15 years. I know when a child is fabricating stories. No 10-year-old can memorize 500 digits of pi. It's simply not possible." Robert had to agree with her. It did seem far-fetched, if not completely impossible. He'd known some bright kids in his time, sure. Kids who could ace tests without studying, who could solve complex problems in their heads. But this was beyond exceptional. This was borderline unbelievable. "Tommy," Robert said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk, "I want to give you a chance to be honest with me right now. Did you make this up to get attention? Because if you did, that's okay. We all make mistakes. But you need to tell the truth and apologize to Mrs. Patricia for disrupting her class." "I didn't make it up," Tommy insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "I really did memorize it. I've been working on it for months." Mrs. Patricia shook her head. This is ridiculous. He's just digging himself deeper into this lie. Robert rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. This was exactly the kind of situation he didn't have time for today. He had budget meetings, parent conferences, and a mountain of paperwork waiting for him. The last thing he needed was a stubborn kid who wouldn't admit he'd been caught in a fib. But something nagged at him. Something in the way Tommy held himself. The quiet determination in his voice despite his obvious fear. The kid wasn't acting like a typical attention seeker. Those kids usually got louder, more dramatic when challenged. Tommy was doing the opposite. He was shrinking into himself but still maintaining his claim. Robert made a decision. He'd call the boy's bluff, give him enough rope to either prove himself or hang himself with his own lie. Either way, this would be resolved quickly, and they could all move on with their day. "All right, Tommy," Robert said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'm going to give you an opportunity here. You say you can recite pi to 500 decimal places. I say that's not possible for someone your age. So let's settle this right now. You're going to recite it for me, and I'm going to check your work on my phone. If you're telling the truth, you'll have nothing to worry about. If you're lying, well, we'll deal with the consequences then. Sound fair?" Tommy's eyes widened. For a moment, Robert thought he saw panic flash across the boy's face, and he prepared himself for a confession. But then something changed. Tommy's jaw set with determination, and he gave a small nod. "Okay," Tommy said quietly. "I'll do it." Mrs. Patricia crossed her arms, a knowing look on her face. This should be interesting. Robert opened a browser on his phone and quickly searched for pi to 1,000 digits. A web page loaded with rows and rows of numbers. He positioned himself so he could watch Tommy while glancing down at his screen to verify the digits. "Whenever you're ready," Robert said, settling back in his chair with the confidence of someone who was about to teach a valuable lesson about honesty. Tommy stood up from his chair, his legs shaky but his expression focused. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath that seemed too big for his small chest, and opened his mouth to speak. What happened next would change everything Robert Henderson thought he knew about teaching, about kids, and about the assumptions he'd been making for the past 25 years. Tommy's voice cut through the silence of the office like a knife through butter. 3.141592655. Robert glanced down at his phone screen, his finger already hovering over the numbers. He expected to catch the kid in his lie within the first few digits, maybe by the 10th or 11th number. But there they were, matching perfectly. His eyebrows raised slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Lucky guess, he thought. The kid probably memorized the first 20 or so digits to make his story more convincing. Tommy continued without hesitation. 897932384626433838279. The numbers kept flowing, steady and sure. Robert's finger moved faster across the screen, checking each digit. 20 numbers, 30, 40, all correct. His confidence began to waver just a bit. This was more than a lucky guess. But still, the kid would slip up soon. He had to. Mrs. Patricia shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her arms still crossed. She looked at Robert, then at Tommy, then back at Robert. A tiny crease appeared between her eyebrows. She'd expected this to be over by now. Expected the boy to stumble and confess within seconds. But Tommy kept going. 5028841971693, 993751058, 209749444, 59230. Robert's scrolling became more frantic. His eyes darted between the phone screen and Tommy's face, looking for any sign of cheating, any hint that someone was feeding him the answers. But Tommy's eyes remained closed, his face peaceful, almost meditative. The boy swayed slightly, as if the numbers themselves were a rhythm only he could hear. 60 digits. 70. 80. The smirk that Robert had been wearing since the challenge began slowly melted away. His mouth went from a confident grin to a tight line, then to something resembling disbelief. He stopped scrolling for a moment, just listening, trying to process what he was witnessing. 7066063, 15588174881520, 92096282925, 409171553, 6436789259003, 6001133, 0. Mrs. Patricia's arms dropped to her sides. She took a step closer, her head tilted like she was trying to figure out a magic trick. How is he doing this? She whispered. Robert didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat had gone dry. He reached for his coffee mug and took a sip, his hand trembling slightly. The coffee had gone cold, but he barely noticed. His entire focus was on the small boy standing in front of his desk, rattling off numbers like he was reading them from an invisible teleprompter. 100 digits passed. Then 120, 150. The principal's office had transformed into something almost sacred. The usual sounds of the school filtered in from outside the closed door. Kids laughing in the hallway, a teacher calling out instructions, the distant ring of a bell. But inside this room, time seemed to have stopped. There was only Tommy's voice and the endless string of numbers. Robert had completely stopped checking his phone. His arm had grown tired from holding it up, and honestly, what was the point? The kid hadn't made a single mistake in over 150 digits. The chances of that being random luck or a good guess were astronomical. No, this was real. This was actually happening. He set his phone down on the desk with a soft thud and simply stared at Tommy. Really looked at him. The worn-out clothes, the too big shirt, the shoes that probably came from a donation bin. This wasn't some privileged kid with expensive tutors and every educational advantage money could buy. This was a child who looked like he barely had the basics, and yet here he stood, performing what seemed like an impossible feat without breaking a sweat. 20567 177 250 2189157 8213 957 877 537 7708484217815 91573. Tommy's voice never wavered. Not once did he pause longer than it took to draw a breath. There was no or no moment of confusion or uncertainty. Each number followed the last with mechanical precision, and yet there was something deeply human about it too. Something that suggested hours and hours of dedication, of practice, of sheer determination. Mrs. Patricia slowly sank into the empty chair beside where Tommy had been sitting. Her face had gone pale. "Mr. Henderson," she breathed. "I've never seen anything like this in my entire career." Robert nodded slowly, unable to form words. He felt something unfamiliar creeping up his spine. Was it shame, guilt? He'd been so quick to judge, so certain that this kid was lying. He'd brought Tommy here to teach him a lesson about honesty, to put him in his place. But the lesson was being taught to him instead, and it was a hard one to swallow. 200 digits came and went. Then 250. Tommy's face remained calm, but small beads of sweat had begun to form on his forehead. His hands, which had been loosely at his sides, were now clenched into gentle fists. This wasn't easy for him, Robert realized. It was taking effort, concentration, mental energy that most adults couldn't sustain for 5 minutes, let alone however long this had been going on. Robert glanced at the clock on the wall. 8 minutes. Tommy had been reciting for 8 solid minutes without a single error. 8 minutes of pure, unfiltered brilliance from a kid who probably went home to an empty apartment and made himself dinner because his parents were working late. The principal felt his eyes begin to burn. When was the last time he'd really paid attention to the quiet kids, the ones who sat in the back and never caused trouble? When was the last time he'd looked past the surface, past the assumptions, past his own jaded experience? 315-6648, 399-3539-02329, 0695078599210, 95964462294895549, 303-81964, 42881, 300. Digits. Mrs. Patricia had tears streaming down her face. She wasn't even trying to hide them anymore. Her hand covered her mouth and her shoulders shook slightly. Whether it was from emotion or shock or a mixture of both, Robert couldn't tell. 350 digits passed. Then 400. Robert's hands gripped the edge of his desk. He felt dizzy, overwhelmed, like the walls of his office were closing in. This wasn't just a kid with a good memory. This was something else entirely. Something exceptional. Something that happened maybe once in a lifetime, if you were lucky enough to witness it. 450 digits. Tommy's voice had grown slightly hoarse, but he pushed on. The determination in his face was almost painful to watch. This mattered to him, Robert realized, not because he wanted to show off or prove people wrong, but because someone had finally given him a chance to be seen, to be heard, to show the world that he was more than his worn-out shoes and his hand-me-down clothes. 9. 270183345. 267957, 073407097, 4639640. Tommy opened his eyes and looked directly at Robert for the first time since he'd started. 500, he said quietly. The office fell into complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The moment stretched out, hanging in the air like morning fog. Then Robert Henderson did something he hadn't done in his office in over 2 decades. He started to cry. Robert quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure. But it was too late. Tommy had seen the tears, and so had Mrs. Patricia. The boy stood there looking confused and a little scared, like he'd done something wrong instead of something miraculous. "Did I mess up?" Tommy asked, his voice small and worried. "I can try again if I got some wrong." "No," Robert managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "No, Tommy, you didn't mess up. Not even a little bit." He stood up from his desk, his legs feeling strangely weak, and walked around to where Tommy stood. He wanted to hug the kid, to tell him how extraordinary he was. But something in Tommy's body language told him the boy wasn't comfortable with physical affection from adults. So instead, he just stood there, looking down at this small miracle in worn-out sneakers. Mrs. Patricia had composed herself enough to speak. "Tommy, I owe you an apology. A big one. I should never have assumed you were lying. I should have listened to you." Her voice cracked on the last word. Tommy shrugged, a gesture so casual it broke Robert's heart. Like being doubted and dismissed was just another normal Tuesday for him. "It's okay. Nobody ever believes me about stuff." Those 7 words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. Nobody ever believes me about stuff. How many times had this kid tried to show someone what he could do, only to be shut down? How many teachers had missed this? How many opportunities had slipped through the cracks because everyone was too busy or too skeptical to really see him? "Wait here," Robert said suddenly, his mind racing. "Both of you, just wait here for a minute." He rushed out of his office, leaving Tommy and Mrs. Patricia staring after him. His feet carried him down the familiar hallways faster than he'd moved in years. Teachers poked their heads out of classrooms at the sound of the principal practically running through the school. He ignored them all. He burst into the counselor's office without knocking. Janet looked up from her computer, startled. She'd been the school counselor for 12 years, and in all that time, she'd never seen Robert Henderson look quite like this. His eyes were red, his tie was crooked, and he was breathing hard. "Janet, I need you in my office right now. And call Dr. Williams from the district. Tell him it's urgent. Tell him I found something he needs to see immediately." "Robert, what's going on? Are you okay? Just trust me, please." Janet grabbed her tablet and followed him out, practically jogging to keep up with his pace. "Can you at least give me a hint about what this is about?" "There's a kid in my office who just recited 500 digits of pi from memory without a single mistake," Robert said, not slowing down. "And I think we've been failing him." They made it back to the office where Tommy sat in the chair again, looking even smaller than before. Mrs. Patricia was crouched next to him, speaking in low, gentle tones, probably still apologizing. Janet's eyes widened when she saw the boy. She'd seen Tommy around school, of course. You couldn't work at a place for 12 years without noticing most of the kids, but she'd never really noticed him, if that made sense. He was one of those children who blended into the background, never causing problems, never standing out. "Tommy," Robert said, trying to catch his breath. "This is Mrs. Davis. She's our school counselor. I'd like her to talk with you for a bit, if that's okay. You're not in any trouble. In fact, you're the complete opposite of in trouble." Tommy looked uncertain. "Am I going to miss more class?" "Don't worry about class right now," Janet said warmly, pulling up a chair beside him. "I just want to chat with you, get to know you better. Your principal tells me you're pretty amazing with numbers." Over the next hour, Janet asked Tommy questions. Not in a clinical way, but like a conversation. She asked about his hobbies, his interests, what he did after school. She pulled out some puzzles and games from her office, the kind designed to test cognitive abilities without feeling like a test. Robert watched through the window of his office, his phone pressed to his ear. He was on his 3rd call with Dr. Williams, the district's gifted education coordinator. The man had been skeptical at first, suggesting that Robert might be exaggerating. But Robert had sent him a video that Mrs. Patricia recorded on her phone, showing the last 2 minutes of Tommy's recitation. Dr. Williams had gone quiet, then said he'd be there within the hour. Mrs. Patricia sat in the corner of the office, her lesson plans forgotten. She kept shaking her head, mumbling to herself. 15 years of teaching. 15 years, and he's been in my class for 2 months. 2 months, and I never saw it. How did I not see it? Robert wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, but he couldn't. Because it was all of their faults, really. The whole system that let bright kids slip through unnoticed. Especially kids who didn't fit the usual profile of gifted. Kids who were quiet. Who didn't have parents advocating for them. Who wore clothes from thrift stores and kept their heads down. Janet emerged from the office an hour later. Her face a mixture of excitement and concern. She motioned for Robert to step into the hallway with her. "Robert, that child is operating on a completely different level," she said quietly, glancing back to make sure Tommy couldn't hear. "I gave him pattern recognition tests that are designed for high school students. He solved them in minutes. I asked him to read a paragraph and tell me about it. He recited the entire thing back to me word for word, not the general idea, not a summary, every single word in order with the same punctuation." Robert felt his knees go weak again. "What are we talking about here, Janet? I'm not qualified to give an official diagnosis, but from what I'm seeing, we're talking about eidetic memory, possibly, exceptionally high IQ. This kid should be in advanced programs, maybe even working several grades above his level. And instead, he's sitting in a regular 5th grade classroom, probably bored out of his mind. Why didn't anyone catch this before?" Janet sighed. "Because he's quiet. Because he doesn't cause trouble. Because when you ask him a question, he gives you the right answer, but not an elaborate one. He's learned to hide, Robert. Kids like Tommy figure out early that being different isn't always a good thing, especially if they don't have support at home." Dr. Williams arrived 20 minutes later, a tall man in his 50s with glasses and a briefcase that looked older than some of the teachers. Robert had worked with him before on gifted placement cases, but this felt different. This felt urgent in a way those other cases hadn't. "Where is he?" Dr. Williams asked, setting down his briefcase. "In my office. But before you go in there, you need to understand something." Robert stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That kid has probably been doubted his entire life. He's been called a liar, been dismissed, been overlooked. So whatever you do in there, you treat him with respect. You treat him like he matters." "Because he does." Dr. Williams nodded slowly. "Understood." The assessment took another 2 hours. Dr. Williams brought out tests that Robert had never seen before. Thick booklets with questions that made his own head hurt just looking at them. Tommy worked through them methodically, his pencil moving across the pages with quiet confidence. When it was finally over, Dr. Williams sat back in his chair and removed his glasses, cleaning them with a small cloth from his pocket. It was a nervous gesture Robert had learned over the years. The gesture he made when he was processing something big. "Well?" Robert asked, unable to wait any longer. Dr. Williams looked at Tommy, then at Robert, then back at Tommy. "Young man, do you know what an IQ is?" Tommy shook his head. "It's a number that helps us understand how people think and learn. The average IQ is around 100. A person with an IQ of 120 is considered above average. 130 and above is considered gifted." Tommy listened carefully, his dark eyes focused on Dr. Williams. "Your IQ, based on the tests I just gave you, is 157. The number hung in the air. Mrs. Patricia, who had returned to the office, gasped. Janet's hand flew to her mouth. Robert felt like someone had knocked the wind out of him. "What does that mean?" Tommy asked. Dr. Williams smiled, a genuine warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It means you're one of the smartest kids I've ever met. And it means we're going to make sure you get the education you deserve." For the first time since he'd walked into the principal's office that morning, Tommy smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and unsure, like he wasn't quite used to the expression, but it was real, and it lit up his entire face. The school day was almost over when Robert finally asked the question that had been nagging at him all afternoon. Tommy sat in the office, munching on a sandwich that Janet had grabbed from the cafeteria, while the adults talked in hushed tones around him. "Tommy," Robert said, pulling his chair closer, "can I ask you something? Where did you learn to do this? The PI memorization, I mean. Did someone teach you?" Tommy swallowed his bite of sandwich and shrugged. "Nobody taught me. I just did it on my own. But why pi? Why 500 digits? That's such a specific thing to memorize." The boy was quiet for a moment, staring at what was left of his sandwich. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. My mom works a lot, 2 jobs. She leaves before I wake up most days and comes home after I go to bed. Sometimes I can't sleep, and the apartment gets really quiet. The neighbors upstairs fight a lot and it's loud, so I needed something to think about instead. Robert felt his chest tighten. He glanced at Janet, who had that look on her face. The one she got when a student's home situation was worse than anyone realized. There's a library 3 blocks from where we live, Tommy continued. They have computers you can use for free. I started going there after school instead of going home to an empty apartment. One day I was reading about math and I found out about pi. I thought it was cool that a number could just go on forever and never repeat a pattern, so I started memorizing it. How long did it take you? Dr. Williams asked, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. 6 months, maybe? I'd memorize 10 digits a day at first. Then I got better at it and could do more. I'd write them down on paper at the library, then go home and practice in my head until I fell asleep. It was like counting sheep except with numbers that actually meant something. Mrs. Patricia wiped her eyes again. She'd been doing a lot of that today. Tommy, why didn't you ever tell anyone about this? Your previous teachers, your mom? I told my 2nd grade teacher once that I could remember entire books after reading them once. She said I had a good imagination. Tommy said it matter-of-factly without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. And my mom is always tired. I don't want to bother her with stuff. She works hard so we can have food and a place to stay. Robert stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the playground where kids were waiting for their buses. His mind was racing. This wasn't just about recognizing a gifted child anymore. This was about a 10-year-old boy who spent his evenings alone in a library because home was too quiet and too lonely. A kid who taught himself extraordinary things because he had nobody else to learn from. We need to call his mother, Robert said, turning back to the room. She needs to know what's happening. Tommy's eyes went wide with panic. Is she going to be mad? She's going to think I caused trouble. No, Janet said quickly, moving to sit beside him. Your mom isn't going to be mad. We're going to tell her something wonderful. We're going to tell her that her son is brilliant. Robert found the contact information in Tommy's school file. The mother's name was Lisa Chen, and there were 2 phone numbers listed. The first one went straight to voicemail. The second rang 4 times before a tired voice answered. Hello? Ms. Chen? This is Robert Henderson, the principal at Lincoln Elementary. I'm calling about your son, Tommy. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Is he hurt? What happened? No, nothing like that. Tommy is fine. Actually, he's more than fine. Ms. Chen, I need you to come to the school if at all possible. There's something important we need to discuss about your son's education. I'm at work. I can't just leave. My shift doesn't end until 8. Robert could hear the stress in her voice, the worry of a parent who couldn't afford to lose a job. I understand, and I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. What if I spoke to your supervisor? Explained that this is a school matter that requires your immediate attention? There was a long pause. What's this about? You're scaring me. Ms. Chen, your son is gifted, exceptionally gifted, and we need to talk about getting him the resources and education he deserves. Another pause, longer this time. Gifted, Tommy? Yes, ma'am. Very much so. I'll be there in an hour, she said, and the line went dead. Robert spent that hour making phone calls. He called the head of the school board. He called the coordinator for the state's gifted program. He even called a colleague at a private school across town that specialized in advanced students, asking about scholarship opportunities. With each conversation, he felt more determined. This kid wasn't going to slip through the cracks. Not on his watch. Lisa Chen arrived exactly 1 hour later, still wearing her uniform from the grocery store where she worked. She was a small woman, probably in her mid-30s, with tired eyes and hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The moment she walked into the office and saw Tommy, her entire face changed. Baby, are you okay? She rushed to him, checking him over like she expected to find injuries. I'm okay, Mom. I'm not in trouble. Ms. Chen, please have a seat, Robert said gently. I know you're worried, but I promise you, this is good news. Over the next 30 minutes, they explained everything. The PI recitation, the tests, the IQ score, Tommy's eidetic memory. Lisa listened, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and finally, something that looked like grief. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she looked at her son, really looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. I didn't know, she whispered. How did I not know? Mom, it's okay, Tommy said, reaching for her hand. No, it's not okay. You're my son and I didn't know you were special. I've been so busy working, trying to keep us afloat, that I missed this. Tears streamed down her face. What kind of mother does that make me? Janet moved quickly, kneeling beside Lisa's chair. It makes you a mother who's doing everything she can to provide for her child. You're working 2 jobs, Miss Chen. You're keeping a roof over his head and food on the table. That's not nothing. That's everything. But he's been going to the library alone, teaching himself things because I'm never home. And that shows how resourceful and independent you've raised him to be, Dr. Williams added. Ms. Chen, there's no guidebook for parenting a gifted child, especially when you're doing it alone. But the fact that Tommy is as kind and grounded as he is, that's because of you. Robert cleared his throat. Ms. Chen, we want to help. The district has programs for gifted students. There are also scholarship opportunities at specialized schools. Tommy should be challenged academically. He should be around other kids who think like he does. Lisa looked overwhelmed. I can't afford special schools. I can barely afford the apartment we have now. That's what scholarships are for, Robert said firmly. And in the meantime, we're going to make changes here. We're going to put Tommy in advanced classes. We're going to get him the materials and support he needs. Why? Lisa asked, her voice breaking. Why are you doing all this? Nobody ever helps people like us. Robert thought about that question. He thought about his 25 years in education, about all the kids he'd probably missed, about the assumptions he'd made. He thought about how close he'd come to dismissing Tommy as just another kid making up stories for attention. Because we almost didn't, he said honestly. Because I almost sent your son back to class with a lecture about lying. Because the system almost failed him completely. And I'll be damned if I let that happen now that I know better. Tommy looked up at his mother, then at Robert, then at all the adults who had spent the day discovering who he really was. That small tentative smile appeared on his face again. Does this mean I can learn harder math? He asked. Everyone in the room laughed, the kind of laugh that comes after crying, the kind that releases tension and creates hope. Yeah, kid, Robert said, his own smile genuine and wide. You can learn all the math you want. 6 months passed like a whirlwind. Robert Henderson stood in the auditorium of the State University, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched Tommy walk across the stage. The boy who had once worn worn-out sneakers now had new shoes, but more importantly, he had something else. Confidence. Purpose. A future that stretched out before him like those infinite digits of pi he loved so much. The memory championship had drawn competitors from all over the state. High school students, college kids, even some adults who made a hobby of memory techniques. And there, among all of them, was 10-year-old Tommy Chen, representing Lincoln Elementary School. The final round had come down to memorizing a shuffled deck of cards in order. Tommy had closed his eyes, looked at the cards once, and then recited every single one without a single mistake. The audience had erupted in applause. The judges had triple-checked his answers, certain there must have been an error. But there wasn't. There never was with Tommy. Now he stood on that stage, holding a trophy that was almost as big as he was, his mother crying in the front row while she clutched a program in her trembling hands. Robert sat next to her, his own eyes misty, thinking about how close they'd all come to missing this moment entirely. After the ceremony, reporters wanted to interview Tommy. The local news had gotten wind of the story, the bright kid from a struggling family who'd memorized pi in a library, because he had nothing else to do. It was the kind of human interest story that people loved, the kind that gave everyone hope. But Robert made sure the reporters kept their distance, at least until Tommy was ready. The kid had been through enough pressure for one day. Instead, they all went out for pizza, something Lisa insisted on paying for herself. She'd been working overtime, saving every penny she could, determined to contribute something to Tommy's education even though the scholarship covered most of it. I still can't believe this is real, Lisa said, watching Tommy demolish his third slice of pepperoni pizza. 6 months ago, I didn't even know he could do any of this. Now he's a state champion. He was always a champion, Robert said. We just weren't looking. Lisa nodded, then turned to face Robert directly. I need to say something, and I need you to hear it. When you called me that day, I was angry at first. I thought Tommy had done something wrong. I was ready to apologize for him, to promise he'd do better. That's what people like me do. We apologize. We stay small. "We don't make waves," Robert started to speak, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish. You could have sent him back to class that day. You could have punished him for disrupting the lesson. Instead, you listened. You gave him a chance to prove himself. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how many people go their whole lives without someone giving them that chance?" "I almost didn't," Robert admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I almost sent him away. But you didn't, that's what matters." Lisa's eyes were fierce now, protective and grateful all at once. "You changed my son's life. You changed our lives." Across the table, Tommy was explaining memory techniques to a couple of college students who had competed in the championship. They listened with rapt attention as he described how he visualized numbers as colors and shapes, how he turned abstract concepts into stories he could walk through in his mind. He spoke with an ease that would have been impossible 6 months ago, when he could barely make eye contact with anyone. The changes at school had been significant. Robert had worked with Dr. Williams to completely restructure Tommy's education. The boy now spent half his day in advanced classes with 8th graders, learning algebra and physics. The other half he worked independently on projects that challenged him, things like coding and advanced literature analysis. A mentor from the state university came twice a week to work with him on competition math problems. But the biggest change wasn't academic. It was social. Tommy had found other kids like him, other students in the gifted program who understood what it was like to think differently. He'd made friends, real friends who wanted to talk about prime numbers and space exploration, and whether infinity could be bigger than infinity. Mrs. Patricia had undergone her own transformation. The guilt of missing Tommy's abilities had hit her hard, but instead of drowning in it, she'd turned it into action. She'd gone back to school, taking courses on gifted education and learning differences. She'd started a program in her classroom where every student got to showcase a special skill once a month, no matter how unusual or unexpected. Already, she'd discovered 2 more kids with exceptional abilities that had been hiding in plain sight. "I'm not making the same mistake twice," she'd told Robert. "Every kid in my class is getting seen. Every single one." Robert himself had changed the most. He'd called a mandatory training for all teachers at Lincoln Elementary, bringing in experts on recognizing hidden giftedness. He'd started a fund to help kids from low-income families access enrichment programs. He'd implemented a new policy that any student who claimed to have a special ability, no matter how outlandish it seemed, would get the chance to demonstrate it without judgment. "We're in the business of opening doors, not closing them," he'd told his staff. "And if we have to look a little foolish to give a kid a chance, then that's what we'll do." The story had spread beyond the school. Other principals from around the district called Robert, asking for advice on how to better identify gifted students who didn't fit the typical profile. The state education board invited him to speak at a conference. A documentary filmmaker reached out, wanting to follow Tommy's journey. But the moment that mattered most to Robert happened on a quiet Tuesday morning, almost exactly 6 months after that fateful day in his office. He was walking down the hallway when he saw a teacher crouched next to a young girl who was crying. The teacher, a first-year educator named Ben who'd been part of the new training, was listening intently. "I know it sounds crazy," the little girl was saying through her tears. "Everyone says I'm making it up, but I can really hear the difference between colors. Red sounds different than blue. Yellow is louder than green." Robert stopped walking, his breath catching in his throat. Synesthesia. The child was describing synesthesia, a rare condition where senses overlap, where sounds have colors or colors have sounds. Ben didn't dismiss her. Didn't tell her she had a good imagination. Instead, he said, "That sounds amazing. Would you like to show me? Can you teach me what different colors sound like to you?" The little girl's face lit up like sunrise. Robert continued walking, his eyes stinging with tears for what felt like the 100th time that year. The culture was changing. The school was changing. And it had all started because one kid insisted he could memorize pi, and one principal who almost didn't listen had decided to give him a chance. That evening, Robert sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He pulled out the video on his phone, the one Mrs. Patricia had recorded of Tommy reciting those final numbers. He'd watched it dozens of times, but it never got old. Each time he saw something different. The determination in Tommy's face, the moment the boy's confidence grew, the instant when everything changed. His computer pinged with a new email. It was from Tommy's account, something Lisa had set up for him so he could communicate with his mentors and teachers. The subject line read, "Thank you." Robert opened it, his hand shaking slightly. "Dear Mr. Henderson," it began. "My mom says I should write this email to tell you thanks for believing in me. But I want you to know something else too. That day in your office I was so scared. I thought you were going to call me a liar like everyone else did. I thought I was going to get in trouble. But you let me try. You let me show you what I could do. Nobody ever did that before. You taught me that asking for a chance isn't wrong. You taught me that being different isn't something to hide. I'm learning so much now and I'm happy. I just wanted you to know that. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for seeing me. Your student, Tommy." Robert read the email 3 times, then printed it out. He pinned it to the wall behind his desk, right where he could see it every single day. A reminder of what education was really about. Not test scores or statistics or policies. It was about seeing children. All of them. Especially the ones who were easiest to miss. He turned off his office light and headed home. But before he left, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at that printed email on the wall. Tomorrow there would be more students who needed to be seen. More kids with hidden abilities waiting for someone to give them a chance. More opportunities to get it right. And Robert Henderson was ready, because he'd learned the most important lesson of his career from a 10-year-old boy in worn-out shoes. Everyone deserves to be believed. Everyone deserves a chance. And sometimes, the most extraordinary things come from the most unexpected places. All you have to do is listen.